My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 39 years old, and this is the story of how the company I helped build quietly decided I was worth more dead than alive. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. I grew up in a small Ohio town where half the houses had porches and the other half had pickup trucks in the driveways. My father taught machine shop at the high school, and my mother worked the night shift at the hospital. Engineering felt like a promise: precise, honest work that you could measure. I learned to like the rhythm of it. Problem, prototype, fix, repeat. By the time I turned 22, I had a degree, a spare bedroom turned office, and a job offer at a tiny consulting firm in Austin. 10 years later, I was the engineering manager at Lindenbridge Systems, a mid-sized firm that designed industrial automation for manufacturing companies across the Midwest and Southeast. Lindenbridge wasn't famous, but for a long time it was mine in a way most people don't ever get to feel ownership over something that isn't technically theirs. I started as a systems engineer and watched the place grow from a handful of clients and a cramped office above a bakery into a 3-story building with a real lobby and a coffee subscription service nobody really asked for. I led teams, mentored juniors, and learned how to pitch budgets to skeptical clients. I negotiated contracts. I brought in enough business to keep entire departments employed. People called me the steady hand, reliable, detail-oriented, the kind of manager who read the room and the fine print. At home, Lena, my wife, and I kept things deliberately ordinary. We had a 2-bedroom rental not far from downtown. She taught 3rd grade and loved the chaos of it. On weekends, we would make pancakes, take the dog for a long walk, and I'd tinker in the garage. The familiarity felt like shelter. My work was intense, but it also had rules. Scope, deliverables, deadlines. There was always a plan. Everything changed the month a new CEO took the helm. I'll be honest, change rarely scares me. I've stayed in plenty of businesses through reorgs, layoffs, and buyouts. But when Lindenbridge's board brought in Thomas Avery, it came with a kind of sheen I hadn't seen before: polished suits, a LinkedIn profile polished to a mirror, and a set of buzzwords that were designed to unsettle. Synergy, lean verticals, resource optimization. He was the sort of leader whose confidence came in canned presentations and whose charisma smelled faintly of aftershave and advisors' memos. Initially, Thomas's presence felt like a fresh start. He smiled in town halls, announced a growth initiative, and promised to expand into new markets. There were pep rallies, a glossy pamphlet, and a reassignment of titles to flatter long-timers. He asked me to lead a strategic group to assess which product lines to scale. I said yes because I believed in building, not tearing down. I always thought that if you stayed good at what you did, the company noticed. I was wrong about what noticed meant. Within months, the word efficiency went from a neutral term to a weapon. It was always framed with numbers: profit margins, payroll percentages, cost per project. One afternoon, in a meeting with HR and finance, Thomas said, almost casually, "We need to ensure compensation reflects market value and contribution. We can't have outliers." Outlier, a softer way of saying problems. He had charts and benchmarking reports that suggested Lindenbridge's compensation structure lagged behind competitors in some grades and outpaced others in places that mattered, namely, my division. I wasn't naive. I knew my team earned more than some others. We had high billable hours, client retention was strong, and when projects went sideways, we fixed them. But much of that extra pay had been earned over years by taking responsibility for problems no one else wanted, working long nights, and keeping clients from walking. I had fought for pay raises. I had argued that retention saved money in the long run. I had advocated for the apprentices and the mid-level engineers who showed up early and stayed late because they believed in the work. It always felt like a trade. Pay more now to avoid the chaos and expense of hiring and rehiring. What I didn't know, and I should have, was that being efficient, profitable, and indispensable sometimes makes you a target. It painted a picture in boardrooms: someone who looks expensive and therefore replaceable by cheaper labor. We can hire younger. We can scale certain roles. We can outsource where it's sensible, Thomas would say, smiling, while his team nodded. They used tables that made it look like the right math. They never said the phrase "too much" in the same voice you'd use to complain about spoiled food. It was softer, almost clinical, but I heard it all the same. I remember the day HR called me in like it was a faint, slow thunder. It was a Wednesday, the sky over Austin gray and humid, and my son's Lego spaceship sat on the passenger seat while I drove to the building. My palms felt clammy. They asked me to close my laptop and breathe. There was a small woman from HR who had always been kind to new hires, a finance director with a stoic face, and Thomas, who didn't look like a man delivering bad news. He looked like a man making an analysis. "We've been reviewing our compensation model across levels," he began. Your performance is excellent, Marcus. No one doubts the work you've done. The words felt rehearsed, humane on the surface, but they were needles sewn into cloth. However, we need to realign costs. We've decided to eliminate your position and transition some responsibilities to a regional team. We will provide severance. When they told me the exact phrasing, eliminate your position, it landed like a scientific report. I asked a question I'd rehearsed 100 ways in my head. Is this because of performance? They shook their heads. No, this is financial structural. Please understand. We value everything you've done. That line was a varnish. I left the meeting with a letter describing severance, COBRA benefits, and the contact for the outplacement service. Outside, people were eating lunch under umbrellas, and life went on as if I hadn't existed for the last decade. That night changed everything. I sat at our kitchen table while Lena made tacos, and I told her what happened. I don't remember the exact words I used. I remember the way she went still and placed her hand on mine like she was holding me down to keep me steady. There were tears, silent and small, the kind that feel heavier than loud ones. Lena didn't yell or blame the company. She worried about rent, about our son's soccer fees, about how to tell him that Daddy wouldn't be going to work on Monday. The first few weeks after the termination move in slow motion. There are practical things that swallow you. Updating resumes, LinkedIn profiles, answering the same sympathetic email from an old colleague. There's also gratitude the company had indeed treated me respectably in the exit. They walked me out with professional courtesy. They recommended me internally for a consulting role, an odd twist. One that I later realized was a polite way of saying, we want your expertise without paying for it. I spent my afternoons applying to roles that either wanted someone 20 years younger or asked for skills that existed only in the cloud of corporate speak. Recruiters said things that felt like compliments until they weren't. You're a great fit culturally, Marcus, but we need someone who's comfortable at a lower rate. Interviews blurred into a pattern of polite acknowledgments and gently closed doors. Meanwhile, rumors took on lives of their own. At neighborhood barbecues, acquaintances would ask how the transition was going. Some people said, I heard they were cutting costs. Others would add an extra layer of sympathy with no follow-through. A few colleagues texted offers of help and then vanished. It's an odd thing to discover who was tied to you only by convenience. In quiet moments, self-doubt crept in. I asked myself if I had become complacent. Had I let my skills go rusty? I replayed conversations and meetings. There were nights when resentment rose like bile, not at the people who made the decision they were doing their jobs as far as the ledger cared, but at a system that measured people by spreadsheets and placed a greater value on short-term savings than long-term knowledge. Months went by. I took contract gigs, small consulting engagements with local factories and a food distributor. I taught a night class at the community college on systems design. Lena's salary kept us afloat. We tightened our budget. The dog got longer walks. There was time for me to read, to think, to breathe without being constantly tethered to a Jira board. For a while, that felt like a luxury. Then something strange began to happen. A former client called me on a Tuesday morning, voice tight. Marcus, we have a problem, he said. A newly implemented automation system had failed during a critical run and halted production for several factories in different states. Lindenbridge had been contracted for the original system and had subcontracted the rollout to a third party after my departure. The third party had used a cheaper, inexperienced team. The fix required years of institutional knowledge that, inconveniently, lived in my head. I'll be candid. Part of me wanted to tell them to call Lindenbridge. I wanted to watch the company stumble under the weight of a decision it had made and feel a perverse sense of vindication. But the tone of their call made me hang up and go. When I stepped into the plants over the next week, I felt like a surgeon walking back into an operating room. Grease-scented air, fluorescent lights buzzing, men and women in safety vests moving like choreographed parts. People who had become accustomed to the hum of machines looked at me in a way that made me remember why I'd always liked the work. It mattered. I diagnosed a cascade of misconfigurations and bypassed fail-safes. It was, in its own way, clear-cut work. After 3 days of hands-on fixes, late nights testing, and a few cups of bad coffee, production resumed. The client was grateful. He asked if I would consult for them long-term. He offered a rate that would have made my bank account swell comfortably again. I accepted, cautiously. It felt odd to be the hero for someone who had been, in effect, abandoned by their vendor. Word spread. My reputation as someone who could walk into chaos and make sense of it did what reputations do. It attracted attention. A former colleague introduced me to an old partner who managed a group specializing in retrofitting older industrial systems. They were short-staffed and overburdened. They asked if I would lead a small, independent team building reliable systems for clients who needed stability over flash. I hesitated. Pride and skepticism had a conversation in my head, but the offer included equity and decision-making latitude. I said yes. We called the project Mercury. We were 10 people at first. A mix of freelancers, a couple of talented mid-level engineers who had been passed over at Lindenbridge, and a young programmer named Aisha who could write control algorithms like a poet writes lines. Mercury operated out of a co-working space with plants and terrible coffee, and we worked in a rhythm that felt more real than corporate sprints. Long problem-solving evenings, whiteboards filled to the edges, and the sound of laughter between the technical discussions. There was also a daily brief text I sent to Lena in the morning. Started Mercury. Coffee bad. Team good. Slowly, Mercury found traction. Our clients were companies tired of disposable vendors. They valued reliability, knowledge retention, and a person you could reach at 3 a.m. And trust. We delivered on those promises. The work was profitable, not at the scale I'd once managed in a corporate role, but the income was steady and, more importantly, my time felt like my own. The success brought with it, inevitably, attention. Lindenbridge noticed. I expected them to extend an olive branch of sorts, a politely phrased offer, an attempt to rehire at reduced terms. I did not, however, expect Thomas to call me personally. He emailed first, then asked to meet. We sat in a downtown cafe with an acoustic piano playing, the sort of place companies pick when they want to have conversations that feel intimate but are actually recorded in the memory of someone's assistant. Thomas looked at me as if we were two chess players circling the board. He was precise and strangely conciliatory. "Marcus," he said, "you've done good work since you left." "I've done what I can," I replied. I was trying to keep it simple. "We're moving in some new directions," he continued, voice measured. "But I wanted to propose something." He placed a glossy brochure on the table. Lindenbridge wanted to subcontract several retrofit projects to Mercury. They were offering revenue, referrals, and a promise of long-term partnership. It felt like a trap. I could sense the implied condition: accept their small business deal and be absorbed into their new model of outsourced efficiency. I kept my answer non-committal. I needed to think. Being solicited by the company that had let me go would look, on paper, like forgiveness. In reality, it felt like a half-step designed to keep us small, to extract our value without acknowledging what we'd built. We took a few projects together, but the terms were not ideal. They took a cut that made operations tight and asked for exclusivity that would have hamstrung our growth. The more we entangled, the more I saw patterns. Our bids were scrutinized in ways that favored their pricing model. They delayed payments, citing administrative realignment, and they suggested junior leads from their own bench as replacements for project managers on our team. It felt like Lindenbridge wanted the benefit of our expertise, but none of the expense of respecting it. Then there was a meeting that would change the course of everything. Thomas invited me to a quarterly partner summit. It was a small gathering of vendors and procurement officers, the sort of event where power dynamics are disguised as networking. During a breakout session on cost leadership, a procurement director from a large manufacturing conglomerate asked a blunt question: "How do you maintain continuity when you keep letting your senior engineers go?" The room turned to look at Thomas. He smiled the smile that had become his armor and said, "We're moving to a model of institutionalized knowledge. It's not about individual compensation anymore. It's about systems." The procurement director nodded, pleased. He liked the sound of systems over people. It's predictable. The director's comments set a tone. They spoke of predictability in a way that made sense to executives whose jobs were to reduce variance. Mercury's model, built on retained expertise and personal accountability, was an outlier in that room. I felt it in my chest, like a cold. After the summit, Thomas pulled me aside. "You should consider scaling differently, Marcus." He used the word scale, the way other people use a scalpel, precise and clinical. "You're doing good work, but your structure is vulnerable. We can help you align with larger procurement standards." What he offered, again, smelled of a bargain. We could continue to access Lindenbridge's pipeline if we ceded certain operational freedoms, adopted their vendor management tools, and accepted a price model that allowed them to layer margins on top. It would mean growth on paper, but less control in practice. It would mean stability packaged as dependency. Around the same time, a younger, shinier company approached Mercury with a buyout proposition. They wanted to acquire us and fold our team into their broader offering. The price was substantial, and their offer included generous payouts for founding members. The CEO was charismatic and earnest. He praised our work and wanted our brand, the brand we had built out of care and craftsmanship. I called a meeting with the team. We had spent nights debugging systems and weekends building relationships with clients. I wanted their voices in the room. We spoke about identity, autonomy, and the future. Aisha, the programmer, said something that cut right to the heart. "We built this so we wouldn't be swallowed by the same short-sightedness. If we sell, Will we still be able to tell clients we care about long-term stability? The decision could have been an easy financial ledger. Take the buyout, ensure safety, cash out. But there's more to work than money. There's the ethics of how you practice a craft and the responsibility you hold for the people who rely on that craft. We declined the acquisition. The day after our refusal, Linden Bridge shifted the ground under us. A large procurement announcement went public. They were consolidating vendors and would be launching a framework that effectively favored pre-qualified, highly standardized suppliers that could match their price and deliver according to their templated models. Mercury's model, rooted in bespoke engineering and senior oversight, didn't fit those templates. Our referral pipeline dried up faster than a puddle in the Sunday. The company's message to their internal teams was simple: we're optimizing for predictable cost models. Internally, I heard a different meaning. We are building structures that favor scale and let us replace expensive, senior knowledge with cheaper, modular processes. It was a slow bleed. Projects that would have naturally moved to us were instead awarded to larger vendors who could promise the standardized pricing that Linden Bridge liked. When we pushed back, citing the long-term cost savings of our approach, we were given lectures about risk and margins and the future of procurement. The emphasis was on quantifiable predictability, even if those numbers hid additional risks down the road. Mercury survived by taking direct work and focusing on regional clients who valued continuity. We tightened our margins, offered flexible payment plans, and kept a small, loyal roster of clients. But the stability that had felt steady turned fragile at the edges. I watched as younger team members received offers from companies that promised salaries we couldn't compete with. We held on because we believed in what we were doing. One rainy afternoon, Thomas called again. He offered Mercury a partnership deal, a new one that would make us a certified vendor under Linden Bridge's new framework, but only if we adopted their vendor management platform and agreed to a pricing structure that left very little room for profit. The catch was that the contract included clauses that effectively transferred certain responsibilities and liabilities to us while keeping the upside for them. It felt like the last straw. I called a meeting with the team. I told them what Linden Bridge was asking. There was silence, and then anger, and then a long practical conversation about survival and dignity. We could capitulate and accept the role of subcontractor small fees for big work, or we could walk away and try to rebuild a market that preferred depth to breadth. We voted to refuse. For a moment, that felt like integrity. For a while, it felt like defiance. Then the slow business attrition set in, and reality tightened its grip. Our cash flow became a constant worry. We trimmed expenses, renegotiated leases, and took on smaller projects. We refocused on what we could control: craftsmanship and trust. A year later, Linden Bridge announced another round of layoffs. The announcement was framed in the now familiar language of realignment and future focus. I felt nothing when I read the press release, only a kind of quiet observation until I saw a list of names somewhere in the industry. Chatter. Several people I had mentored were on that list. It stung in a way I couldn't let myself process publicly. I reached out to some of them, offering what help I could. The irony was cruel. The same company that had declared people dispensable because of cost cuts had just released a roster of talent in which entire functional knowledge vacuums existed. Mercury continued to do the work that mattered. We fixed old systems, taught clients how to maintain them, and hired slow, careful people who wanted long careers rather than a quick paycheck. Over time, being known for reliability built a different kind of stability. It was smaller, less lucrative, but it felt honest. The turning point for me wasn't the initial firing. It was realizing how fragile institutional memory is when a company decides that the math on a spreadsheet is worth more than the people who hold it. That realization shaped Mercury's mission: to show that retaining expertise pays off over the long term. Years later, I ran into Thomas at a regional industry conference. He looked the same, polished, confident. He asked how I was, and I told him the truth in the plainest terms I could. We kept on, I said. Not as big, not as flashy, but we kept on. He nodded. We needed to move fast, he said. Things change. Change is fine, I replied. But you can't optimize human knowledge out of the equation without paying for it later. He sighed, and for the first time I saw a crack in his practiced composure. We underestimated the hidden costs, he admitted. It was not an apology, merely a concession. Market pressures are complicated. That's the thing about corporate decisions. They rarely come with the clean moral of a story. They come with a tangle of competing incentives, risk assessments, and the need to show quarterly performance. The people who lose are usually the ones who are hardest to measure: the steady hands, the mentors, the ones who remember why something was done a certain way in the first place. We didn't get a boardroom apology. We didn't get a grand vindication. What we got was steady work, a small but growing client base, and a team that stayed because they believed in something more than a title or a paycheck. My relationship with Lena changed in small, important ways. We stopped pretending that stability meant an unbroken climb. We learned to measure success differently. In dinners together, in the way our son learned to fix a bicycle, in the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved without shortcuts. If there was a moral to it, it's this. Companies are made of people. And when leaders treat those people like replaceable parts, they forget that knowledge lives in hands and heads, not in process charts. Cutting costs can look efficient on a report, but it often leaves a mess someone else has to clean up later. The real cost of efficiency is the erosion of institutional memory, a cost that shows up as outages, talent loss, and a slow, corrosive decline in the quality of work. I don't tell the story to shame or gloat. I tell it because I've seen both sides. I was fired for being expensive. I also helped build something after that firing that paid people fairly and treated work as a craft. There is dignity in choosing the long view over the quick fix. There's also a need for humility and leadership to recognize that not every function can be replaced by a process without diminishing what made the process work in the first place. Lena still laughs at my attempts to keep a garden alive. The dog is older and slower and sleeps at our feet while I work. Mercury isn't a corporate giant. It's a collection of people who want to do good work and be compensated fairly for it. We're not perfect, and we make mistakes. But we're building something that, I hope, will outlast any spreadsheet that thinks it can measure the human cost of expertise. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Expertise saves money.